Chapter 20. One day at a time. Now that I knew Doris was alive, I was afraid what the next day would bring. How would she accept me, this skeleton of a mother with hedgehog hair? Would she even recognize me? After all, it had been nearly 3 years, practically half her life, since she had seen me. During that time, she had lived with new parents. Why would she want to leave them to come with me, a woman she barely knew? To make matters worse, I had no money and no place for us to stay. But life had taught me to live from hour to hour, and at that moment, I knew only that I had to see Doris. Reines had the use of a military jeep, and he drove Helen to see Doris. On the way, he told her some very surprising news. Stijn de Boer, Doris's foster mother for the past 3 years, was Joe Vies's sister. Joe, their friend in the underground who had found them so many hiding places before he himself was sent to Dachau. Helen hadn't even known that Joe had a sister, let alone that she was Doris's foster mother. All this time, Helen had thought that her daughter was living with total strangers. The secrecy of the underground had worked very well. What had happened to Joe? Helen wanted to know. Reines explained that Joe had saved the lives of 40 other people, most of the Jews. When he was arrested by the Nazis and shipped to Dachau, he had 45 people under his care. Even after the camp was liberated, Joe stayed on for 2 months until he was sure the last sick prisoner had been cared for and sent home. Now, as they made their way toward the Krommenie, the small town where Doris was living, Reines told Helen what life had been like around Amsterdam in the last year. Hunger, he said, was in every house. There had been no electricity or phones, no transportation, no heat or cooking facilities since September of 1944. Almost a year. Everyone had suffered and continued to suffer. And how had Doris fared during those hard times? Helen wanted to know. Reines explained that both mentally and physically the child was doing well. To make it easier on her foster parents had said that her father was in the war and that her mother was very sick. No one knew when or if she would return. It would not have been safe for Doris to know her true story. Had word gotten out that she was Jewish, it could have endangered the entire household and the underground workers as well. Reines assured Helen that Doris was very happy with the de Boers. Rarely had she asked about her real parents, which is what Helen and Siegfried had wanted. It was lunchtime when we arrived, and Doris was sitting at the table, eating. She had never seen a jeep and took a long time looking at it, but not at me. I did not move from the doorway. For some time, she acted as if I were not there and talked to Reines about school and her friends. Suddenly, she turned to me and asked in Dutch, using the formal way of addressing a stranger, "Are you my mother?" I moved a few steps closer to her and said that yes, I was her mother. What I wanted to do was to take her in my arms and hold her, but I was afraid of making any wrong moves. I didn't want to frighten her and lose her just at the moment I had found her. In the end, Doris saved the situation by saying she had to go back to school and asking if she could be driven in the jeep. She wanted everybody at school to see the jeep, but not her mother. Helen now faced a difficult decision. Should she take Doris from the secure home where she had lived safely for 3 years? Or should she let her stay on with the de Boers? Had Helen survived Auschwitz and Kratzau, living each day in the hope of finding her child only to give her up now? More than anything in the world, she wanted to take Doris with her. But where? She had no home and no money. How could she care for her child? Many Jewish children who had been put into hiding had mixed feelings when their parents returned. They were glad that their mother or father had survived, but so much had happened, so many things had changed while they were apart, that it was impossible to love them in the same way as before. To protect these children against the chance that their mother or father might not return, many foster families never talked with the children about their real parents. It'd be too cruel to build up their hopes only to have their parents die in a concentration camp. And so, as the months went by with no mention of Mama or Papa, the memory of them did die in many of the children's minds. By the time one or both parents returned after liberation, many of the hidden children had adjusted to their new homes and families. It was a shock to see their real mother or father again. How do you love a parent who left you behind? One who had been physically and mentally destroyed. A parent who has no money, no food, no home for you? For many children, seeing their mother or father again was like coming face to face with a stranger. Helen realized it would be very hard for Doris to leave her secure home, but she also knew she had to take her. All that she had been living for was to find the child. She could not leave her now, even though it might be the right decision. We took Doris back to school and returned to the Dobores house. Without talking to anybody, I asked if I could take Doris with me the next day. I could give them no reason why I wanted to take her. I only knew that I needed this child to give me strength. I had a strong feeling that I was drowning in a world that had no place for me. The responsibility of taking care of my child would give me the strength I needed to go on. Our friends the Rusniks found an attic where we could live. There was no furniture, bath, or kitchen, but we had 2 rooms for ourselves. As the weeks passed, I began to worry about Doris. She was awake every night, crying, vomiting, and obviously very unhappy. When I took her to the doctor, he had no answer. During one particularly upsetting day, when I scolded her for something, she turned to me and screamed, "I wish you had never come back." Both of us cried. Picking up the pieces of their shattered lives was very, very difficult, but most survivors found a way to begin again. By November, Helen and Doris were able to move back to the neighborhood they had lived in before they had gone into hiding. Only 3 years had passed, but those had been an endless 3 years. One by one, they looked up old friends and heard stories of the nightmares they'd endured. As she listened to her friends' stories, Helen was reminded of the words of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Germany's most famous poet. "May God not give me what I am unable to carry." The survivors had proven that human beings could carry a tremendously heavy burden, and, sadly, God had given it to them. Time passed with no signs, no message from Siegfried. Our friends continued to collect odds and ends of furniture, which made us a real home. I told Doris so much about the wonderful people who helped us that she was glad to meet them. One day we visited Grie and Mavertje. They still lived at the house in Haarlem, where Siegfried and I had hidden for more than a year, and where we were finally discovered by the Gestapo. Mavertje told me that all the bedding, blankets, clothing, everything we had in the little room had been given to her by the SS to keep. This seemed very strange. In all the cases we knew, the people who had been discovered hiding Jews were severely punished. Yet Mavertje had been rewarded with our belongings? As I learned more about the way the Gestapo hunted Jews, I discovered that people were paid money for every Jew they turned in. Slowly my suspicion grew that Mavertje had gotten scared and decided to take reward money for turning in Siegfried and me. I felt bad that these suspicions ever came into my mind, but they did. None of our friends could suggest anyone else might have committed this unspeakable crime. If Helen had wanted to learn the truth about Mavertje, her friends in the underground probably could have found out. But there was no time or reason to dwell on such bitter thoughts. She was too busy trying to build a new life for herself and Doris. Thus far, Siegfried's former boss had been paying them a small amount to help them get by. But now it was time to find work and become independent. Through Reunited, Helen learned about a job in an orphanage for Dutch children. The parents of these children were in jail for having helped the Nazis during the war. Because of what their parents had done, nobody wanted to take care of the children. The orphanage needed a house mother, and Helen applied for the job. Hearing about these innocent children reminded me of our own Jewish children, who were taken from us, and in the end were murdered. I wanted to work in this home. I worried that because these children were living in a world that hated them for what their parents had done, that they too might grow up to hate. When I went for my interview, the man who ran the home told me, "You are the most logical person to care for these children. But," he added, "I do not think that you are ready yourself to take on the job. Your soul is still like a stone. You are without any emotion." I was disappointed that I did not get the job, but I understood what the man was saying. It was true. My mind and emotions had not yet begun to heal. Still, I continued to believe that these children, or any children, should never have to suffer for what their parents had done. Younger generations should never be blamed or hated for the crimes of their elders. Although she could not find a job, Helen did hear of a good opportunity for Doris. The country of Switzerland was offering to take for the summer 300 Dutch children who had suffered from malnutrition during the war. Doris could go if a family could be found with whom she could live. At last a family was located. Doris made the trip and returned from Switzerland at the end of the summer, a much healthier and happier child. Helen spent that summer of 1946 recovering physically and mentally. Nearly a year had passed since her return to Holland, but still there was no word from Siegfried. It was time, she told herself, to accept the fact that he might never return. At first I was sure that he was alive at some place under Russian protection. But as time went on, I had to admit, he was never physically strong, always very concerned about body cleanliness. He was a sensitive person who appreciated beauty in art, in music, in books, and he liked people to behave properly, to show good taste. How could he really fight all that was expected to break each of us? Siegfried, in his way, must have given up hope before his time. Now that she must be both a mother and father to Doris, Helen had to decide what route their lives would take. Her parents urged her to come to the United States to be near them, but Helen desperately wanted to stay in Holland, for she had grown up to love the Dutch people. At last, realizing that Doris would grow up without any relatives if they stayed in Europe, she made the decision to go. Friend Reines arranged passage on a ship, and all that remained was to find the money to buy the tickets. Siegfried's former boss was still paying Helen part of her husband's salary. Guessing that he might like to be rid of this responsibility, Helen asked him for one final favor. Would he buy the tickets to the United States? He would. I was deadly afraid of the United States and the thought of beginning a new life there. It seemed that just when I had begun to build up some security, I must uproot again. But I had to consider that Doris and I were not, and probably never could, become citizens of Holland. At least in the United States, we would have a chance at citizenship. And so, on January 31st, 1947, we sailed from Rotterdam, the Dutch city that had been so badly bombed during the war. Doris was very excited. I was crying bitterly. During the trip, Doris was seasick much of the time, and I was so queasy that I could not eat the most beautiful food I had seen in years. After a stormy, uncomfortable crossing, we arrived in New York on February 10, 1947. As the Statue of Liberty came into view, I cried, not for joy, but because I wanted to go home. I was very frightened, knowing so little about this country, but I could not forget that my father, mother, and brother had come here, not knowing the language either, and with less education. They had made it, and so would I.